Right, well, we've heard from some extraordinary physicists and biologists and historians and musicians and inventors and intellectuals, and now I'm going to talk about messing around, having fun. 24 years ago, I was lucky enough to join a fantastic team to climb a new route up the world's highest mountain. And mountaineering is a strange pursuit full of paradox and inconsistencies. On the one hand, it is fun. It's enormously fun. It's hugely pleasurable. It's the search for pleasure, but it's also deadly serious, even at times dangerous. It's intensely egotistical, it's selfish, but it also teaches humility, and it involves a lot of collaborative teamwork. It's a fascinating business. I think the real motivation for me is that it's really about landscape. It's actually something aesthetic, which is why any suggestion of trying to make mountaineering into an Olympic sport is completely fatuous. For me, it's the aesthetic element which is the real driving force. These sandstone boulders strewn wantonly over ancient Lewisham gneiss rocks in northern Scotland with pale gleaming quartzite in the background and Loch Maree still cloaked with the remains of the ancient Caledonian forest. That's one of the reasons for going to these places. Rocks are beautiful. Rocks demand to be grasped. Climbing is a tactile business. At its best, it's actually a kind of dance. The idea of me dancing might seem absurd, but it is. It's a kind of dance. It's intensely physical, but it also involves decision-making. It's also cerebral. I have a psychologist friend who trains businesses, and he likes to talk about something he calls motivational richness, by which I think he means having as many different reasons for doing a thing as you possibly can, different satisfactions. And that's certainly true of mountaineering. It's also about travel. It's about going to new places. This was my first sight of Afghanistan on my first ever expedition to the Himalayas. Whole new experiences. It's about, paradoxically, you're going to wilderness, but also you're meeting other people. You're meeting people like these Gujjar tribesmen in northern Kashmir, where I was climbing with a friend called Dick Rinshaw. Well, on that occasion, the obscure object of our possibly peculiar desires was this mountain, which rises to about 20,000 feet above sea level. Our ostensible purpose was to get to this ridiculous point in the sky, because no one had been there before. It's a childish, egotistical thing to want to do. But what gives it purpose and reason is not getting there. The getting there is really irrelevant. What is interesting is how you get there, and it's the journey to get there. It's the process of getting there. And the thrill, we're driven by curiosity, by seeking a sense of surprise, wondering what lies round the next corner. What might this great sheer face of granite smeared with ice and snow, what might it be like? And let's go and find out. And even, I dare say it, mountaineering can even be quite creative. You're creating a line up a mountain day by day, seeking out the route, seeing if that line will conform to your plans. And it doesn't always. There are little variations and wiggles along the route. And each night you settle down for the night. You hope somewhere comfortable, occasionally not so comfortable. On this third night on this climb, this was the best we could manage. We had to sit side by side on a little ledge. But the reward was to continue this journey through this beautiful vertical landscape, teasing out the route as we went, and eventually, after a final bivouac, reaching that summit. The descent is another story, but it's also part of the challenge. About 4 years later, I'd been making a sort of steady progression eastward from Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, eventually into Nepal and Tibet. And about 4 years after that Kashmir climb, I was on the Tibet-Nepal border. It was about my 9th trip to the Himalaya, and it was the first time I saw, about 60 miles away in the distance, the highest mountain on Earth. Well, there it is. It rises to nearly 9,000 meters above sea level. And there's a wonderful paradox that right on the summit of the world's highest mountain are ancient fossilized corals, which were created in a seabed about 250 million years ago. And at the base of Everest, there are young, pale granites, leucogranites, which have been squeezed up from under the Tibetan plateau less than 10 million years ago. And then in the last 100 years, there's been the human history, which has overlaid that dead geology. And for me, that's what makes this particular mountain interesting. It's the stories, it's the narrative that overlays the bald geology. And there are many people in that story, and it goes back to 1921. There are people like Julie's great-uncle, Sandy Irvine, who sadly died on the mountain in 1924. There was Eric Shipton, the chap on the right in this picture, wonderful character, one of the great explorers of the last century. Here he is in 1933 with Frank Smythe, and it was Frank Smythe, along with two others that year, 1933, who reached a high point less than 1,000 feet from the summit of Everest without any supplementary oxygen, just breathing the thin, thin air and managing as best he could. That record was finally broken in 1978, when John was starting his punk band. Is that right? These two chaps were up there on Everest, also destroying their brain cells by lack of oxygen. The first two people, Peter Haberler and Reinhold Messner, to reach the summit of Everest without oxygen. And at the time, we thought, they're supermen. They're superhuman. But it's a bit like the 4-minute mile. Someone else does it, you think, well, maybe I could do it too, why not? And that's the wonderful thing about human progress. Well, my chance to go to this great mountain came 10 years later, in 1988, when I joined an expedition to the great east face, the biggest face on Mount Everest, the Kangshung face. Well, this was the team gathered in Tibet. Many people worked to make this expedition possible, but I want to concentrate on the 4 climbers, because the great joy to me, again, it's not whether you get to the top, it's how you get to the top. That's what makes it interesting. We were a very small team. Small teams are efficient, and you're motivated because you've got a real share in the decision-making, a share of the glory. Well, there were 4 of us, a carpenter from Canada called Paul Tier, a fellow sort of jobbing mountain writer, stroke guide, stroke layabout from Colorado called Ed Webster. Also, Robert Anderson from Colorado, the only person actually in the team who had a proper job. He's in the advertising business. And then sort of parachuted unceremoniously into the midst of this essentially American enterprise was myself, the one Brit. I'm a great believer in serendipity. And if I hadn't happened to go and meet someone in a pub once in Wiltshire, this great adventure might not have happened for me. But I did meet a delightful man called John Hunt, who in 1953 led the first ascent of Everest. I got to know him. He was honorary leader of this American expedition. He put my name forward and suggested that I might go with them. He also gave us introductions to some of the same sponsors. And there's something good about having upmarket sponsors. It leads to a sort of sense of expectation. Yeah, it's still ticking. Sense of expectation. Sense of this was a classy expedition. There's a sense this is something quite special. This is going to be a great adventure. And yes, we think we might too manage without oxygen equipment. We're going to try anyway. A great spirit of possibility. And then we came face to face with the reality of this great ice wall that we'd come to climb, and it did look very scary. And suddenly we remembered all those rather unencouraging remarks from the skeptics when we'd set off from America and Europe. 4 people, you're mad. Go and climb a smaller mountain. Not really the kind of encouraging words you want as you set off. But I think there's something about well-meant advice from older, wiser people. You listen politely, and then you probably ignore it and just carry on regardless. And that's what I liked about this expedition. There was a spirit of cocking a snook, of saying, let's just give this thing a try. And while we're about it, we're going to enjoy ourselves. We hear a lot about tragedy and death and misery and jealousy and all the worst possible things on Mount Everest. Actually, climbing Everest, I maintain, can actually be fun. Well, this is what we came to climb. To you, it probably looks incomprehensible. To me, it looks fascinating and unique and wonderful and inspiring. But it's basically 8,000 feet of unclimbed Everest, at which we hoped to draw a line. And we proceeded to set about doing that. And the thrill was actually to find oneself on the first day grappling with these rocks, climbing up this steep ice, mindful of those avalanches. You might see an avalanche crashing down in the background, but relieved that we'd chosen a route which, by and large, avoided the worst threat of those avalanches. Now, my default mode is idleness. I hate the sound of an alarm clock, but at times you do have to pull a finger out and do some hard work. And I came across this quotation quite recently. It is by his activities and not by enjoyment that man feels he is alive. In idleness, we not only feel that life is fleeting, but we also feel lifeless. Well, I don't know how accurate that translation is from the German, from Immanuel Kant. And by enjoyment, I think he's talking about enjoyment in the sense of just something you receive passively. Real enjoyment is when you're actually doing something, creating something, when you're working at something, and when you're involved in a project. And that was certainly true of this expedition. Yes, I hate getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, but the rewards are worth it. To be up there at dawn, to see the sun rising over the immense spaces of Tibet as we looked out from our great east face was thrilling. And I had a real strong sense of there is nowhere else I would rather be as this route unfolded. That sense of being totally in the present is very exhilarating. A climbing philosopher friend of mine called Phil Bartlett was giving a lecture in London last night, and he said the marvellous thing about an expedition is the simplicity, the deliberate simplicity. There's very little to do, and there's time to do it really well. Well, here's Ed Webster leading up some very steep ice, which eventually got us onto some extraordinary ice towers. And there was a wonderful sense of delighting in look what we've done, look where we've ended up. Isn't this bizarre? Isn't this extraordinary frozen landscape? That was the 6th day of 4 of us working away at this climb. But it was on that day that we were brought up short. Our bumptiousness was brought swiftly back down to earth when we stumbled across a severe obstacle on our way, an enormous great crevasse, which literally sort of stopped us dead in our tracks. You go on a British expedition, and generally, certainly British mountaineers, who tend to be fairly introverted, sit around sort of fiddling with their beards and mumbling and not communicating. You go on an American expedition and people actually talk to each other. It was rather invigorating. We discussed things, we mulled things over, and we thought, we're not going to let this crevasse beat us. We can sort it out. We'll deal with it. And that's what we set off to do after a rest at base camp. This is where we'd got so far. We now established what we call Camp 1 on those crazy ice towers. And I then had to eat quite a large slice of humble pie. I rather fancied myself dealing with this crevasse and being very heroic in the process. I had to accept rather reluctantly that I wasn't the most skillful climber on this team, and it was Robert and Ed Webster here, the chap looking a bit groggy there with a high altitude headache, that they would occupy Camp 1 and deal with the crevasse, while Paul the carpenter and actually, I used to do a bit of carpentry too. We would basically be on yak duty, beasts of burden carrying luggage up the ropes to Camp 1, while it was Ed who did a real virtuoso piece of climbing, which I wish I had witnessed, but Rob took these pictures of Ed doing some astonishing climbing to get out of the depths of this great crevasse and eventually create a rope bridge across it to enable us to continue with this gloriously pointless quest to the summit of Everest. And there's me going across Ed's rope bridge a few days later. And you always learn things from new teams. You learn, and I hope, a bit of humility. It was Paul, when we were up there a few days later, who said, look, the weather's not very good. We're wasting our time. Let's go down to base. You can overdo these things. At times, you just have to sit back and wait for better conditions. So again, we went back to base to rest and recuperate before returning to the fray and eventually pushing our route right up to where we established a second camp. And then again, there was more bad weather. There was more hanging around. This is an advanced base, a whole week of bad weather, watching, waiting. And just to try and give you some notion of time scale in a talk that's lasting 18 minutes, I think we're still okay. This expedition altogether involved me for 4 months. We actually spent 6 weeks climbing Everest altogether. A lot of up and down, a lot of patience required. It was a slow, steady journey with many disappointments along the way. But eventually, on the most exhausting day of our life, the 4 of us completed our new route up the east face of Mount Everest to arrive at a point nearly 8,000 meters above sea level. And here we are arriving on the famous South Col of Everest. I mentioned the history, the ghosts, the legends. We thought, yes, so many people have been to this place before, but from Nepal, from the other side, we're the first to come from this side. We thought particularly of the people who'd been there back in 1953 and of John Hunt, the honorary leader of our expedition, who'd been here 35 years earlier. And then we settled into our tents, looking briefly up at the summit pyramid above and wondering if we were actually going to be capable of climbing those final grueling 900 meters. But you take everything one step at a time, and a bit like what Benedict was saying about the setbacks in the Amazon jungle. He said, well, I could see 100 meters. I'd concentrate on that. And then the next 100 meters. Well, it's a bit the same. You take everything one step at a time and concentrate on the grim business of survival in your little tent. It was very windy that night. There was no hope of continuing to the summit. And in the morning, we discovered that Paul hadn't been feeling very well, and all felt rather uneasy when he just said he was going to go down on his own because he didn't feel well. To my mind, that was the only truly courageous decision anyone made on this expedition. It left three of us with a chance, as the weather improved that night, the next night, of continuing to the summit. And we actually set off at 11 o'clock at night. And there we are, setting off, having no idea whether we were capable of climbing those last 900 meters. But there's only one way to find out. Well, like Mr. Trafford in the Amazon, we did a risk assessment, and we concluded this is bloody dangerous. But we'll go anyway. Occasionally in life, you have to stick your neck out. I think Sigmund Freud came up with an awful lot of nonsense. But I did discover the other day this, and a lot of people have made a lot of money out of that nonsense, but I did discover the other day this remark he made, which actually I thought was quite pertinent to what I'm talking about. Life is impoverished. It loses its interest when the highest stake in the game, life itself, may not be risked. Freud was saying that in the context of war. War is fought ostensibly for moral or political purposes. Climbing is pure self-indulgence. But I do think there is a value in risk, in occasionally being able to let go. Of course we didn't want to die. Of course we had every intention of doing everything we could to come back alive. But occasionally in life, you do sometimes have to step a little bit outside that comfort zone. So we set off, the three of us, in the dark. And eventually, after many hours, there was a wonderful realization that there was light glimmering in the east. And then that monochrome world was changing to color. And suddenly, the world seemed a beautiful place again. And you thought, wow, how lucky we are to be up here with Ed. I wish I'd taken this picture. Ed took it. Wonderful picture he took at dawn. He also took this picture many hours later, and it sums up, I think, this sequence, just the sheer grim physical and mental struggle of a human being trying to operate in an environment for which it was not designed. Because basically, as one doctor put it to me, when human beings climb to 29,000 feet above sea level, what's happening is you're dying very fast. But this picture of Robert slumped in the snow, I think, sums up what we were all going through. You're crossing barriers and trying to push yourself further and further. And thinking of those pioneers who came 35 years earlier, Tenzing Norgay and Ed Hillary, using oxygen but going where no one had been before them. And then it was the thrill of seeing the famous Hillary Step. At this point, the other two were behind, I was ahead. I continued to the summit and reached the summit late in the afternoon. And the other two, Robert and Ed, had to turn around at the south summit, just short of the top, shortly before nightfall. By the time I was coming back over the south summit, they were already disappearing on their way down. And eventually, as it grew dark, I realized that I was going to have to stop. I hadn't made it back to our camp. I was going to have to stop at about 28,000 feet above sea level and spend a night out in the open without any shelter. At the time, it was an altitude record for a solo bivouac, but You just have to get on with it and think, well, other people have done similar things. Eventually, this long night will come to an end, and you can continue down. Rejoin your friends who'd also spent the night out in an abandoned tent with sort of a modicum of shelter, but we were all pretty battered. The story of our eventual descent of the face is a long saga, which I'm not telling now, because I'm coming to the end of my talk. I just want to say one thing, though. I was lucky enough to join a fantastic team. They were brilliant. And they were brilliant because each of us had a share in the decision-making. Each of us was able, when the occasion demanded, to hand over to someone else. I was supremely ambitious and driven and bloody-minded in reaching the summit. But the only thing that matters on a mountain is coming back down again. Otherwise, it's pointless. And on that descent, it was Ed Webster, who was the driving force, who kept us moving, so eventually we got safely back down to Earth, eventually descending our fixed ropes in the dark 9 days after setting out. And here we are, looking rather battered after our grueling adventure. Battered, but supremely happy with a fantastic experience, which I've been delighted to share with you tonight. And I think that brings us to the end of our conference. There we are. Thank you. Thanks.